Good afternoon. Welcome to today's installment in the Marshall Center Lecture Series. My name is Richard Dagger. I am a member of the Political Science Department here at the University of Richmond, and also a member of the program in Philosophy, Politics, Economics, and Law. One of the many reasons for a student of political theory to be happy at the University of Richmond, even one who is not ensconced in the Jepson School, is the frequency with which the Jepson School and the Marshall Institute in particular bring distinguished and provocative political theorists to our campus. Today's speaker, Professor Harvey Mansfield of Harvard University, is exemplary in both of those respects. For Harvey Mansfield is not only a scholar of unquestionable distinction, he is also one who has gained a reputation beyond the confines of the seminar room and the classroom as a public intellectual who has much to say, and much of a provocative nature to say, about important trends both within academia and beyond its boundaries. His efforts to combat grade inflation, for example, have caught the attention of people who know relatively little of his scholarly work. And he is surely one of the few political theorists to exchange a high five with Stephen Colbert on the Colbert Report. Whether that distinction is one that Professor Mansfield cherishes or regrets, I shall leave for him to say if he is of a mind to do so. What I do want to say, as a student of political theory, is that it is a great pleasure to have him with us today. Professor Mansfield is the article of many books and articles about the major figures of modern political thought: Thomas Hobbes, Edmund Burke, Alexis de Tocqueville, and the subject of today's talk, Niccolo Machiavelli. These works include not only learned analyses of what Hobbes and Burke and Tocqueville and Machiavelli and others have had to say, but also, in the cases of Tocqueville and Machiavelli, valuable translations of their works. Now, if you've looked at the biographical vignette attached to the announcement of today's talk, you may have noticed that Professor Mansfield claims hardly to have left Harvard since arriving there as a freshman in 1949, as I recall. I'm very grateful that perhaps despite, or perhaps because of the weather in Boston, he has left there today, and I'm very much looking forward to what he has to tell us about Machiavelli's enterprise. I now introduce to you Professor Harvey Mansfield of Harvard University.
Thank you very much, Professor Dagger, for the very gracious introduction. It's a pleasure to be back here at the University of Richmond, and my friends, especially the McDowells. Well, there's two of you sitting around here I recognize. I'm going to talk today about Machiavelli and his enterprise. He said he had an enterprise. He once referred to my enterprise, la mia impresa. Now, 500 years ago, but now it's 501 or so, on December 10th, 1513, Machiavelli wrote a letter to a friend of his in Rome, describing one day in his life as an exile from Florence, and remarking casually that he'd just completed writing The Prince. This momentous book, together with its companion, The Discourses on Livy, neither of which was published until after his death, so they were published in 1531-32, announces an enterprise affecting all human beings today. That is the modern world. I'm going to talk about one paragraph from The Prince today, especially, and actually a phrase of 2 words, which occurs in that paragraph. And so to get us started, what I'm going to do is read to you that paragraph, which comes from somebody's translation. Because I'm not going to give it to you in Italian. So here it goes. This is chapter 15. And it's a chapter about the things for which princes and the rest of us are praised and blamed. And here's how it goes. It remains now, he says, to see what the modes in government of a prince should be with subjects and with friends. And because I know that many have written of this, I fear that in writing of it again, I may be held presumptuous, especially since in disputing this matter, I depart from the orders of others. So this is what he's going to say that's new. But since my intent is to write something useful to whoever understands it, it has appeared to me more fitting to go directly to the effectual truth. And that's the phrase I'm going to talk about today. Effectual truth, verità effettuale, of the thing, than to the imagination of it. Effectual truth versus the imagination of it. And many have imagined republics and principalities that have never been seen or known to exist in truth. For it is so far from how one lives to how one should live, that he who lets go of what is done for what should be done learns his ruin rather than his preservation. For a man who wants to make a profession of good in all regards must come to ruin among so many who are not good. Hence it is necessary to a prince, if he wants to maintain himself, to learn to be able not to be good, and to use this and not use it according to necessity. So that's this phrase, effectual truth, what he's bringing that's new. Machiavelli concentrates the power of this phrase by using it just this once in all his writings. Indeed, Machiavelli scholars have been unable to find any other use of the term in the Italian Renaissance among humanist authors, and I'm not aware of any earlier use of it. Effettuale, effectual, seems to be a word that Machiavelli invented. With this new phrase, he says he departs from the orders of others. In it are contained new truth in philosophy and new effectiveness in politics, together elevating politics and bringing philosophy down to earth. I'll set forth the idea that Machiavelli was not caused by his context, but was the cause of the context, our context. He is the founder of modern political science, who also laid the foundation of modern philosophy and modern science by discovering what we today call fact, and who created what is today broadly called the modern world. Elevated politics and lowered philosophy come together in the prince, understood not merely as a ruler, but also as a thinker or prophet, devoted to improving the prospects of princes, and incidentally or not incidentally, their peoples, so that princes under Machiavelli's instruction become knowers of the world. He himself, he says in the discourses, conveys as much as he knows and has learned through long practice and continual reading in worldly things, cose del mondo. What are these? Machiavelli seems to confine himself to politics, but he expands politics to include the world, implying that the world governs politics, or politics governs the world, or both. In his day, any notion of the world immediately raised the question of which world? This one or the next? This is his context, the context as he lets us know, as opposed to a context which is imposed on him. This world or the next. Here, religion and philosophy dispute the question of which world governs the other, and whether politics can manage or God must provide for human fortunes. Fortune or fortuna being, as everyone knows, a prominent theme of Machiavelli's. For Machiavelli, the world is this world. With verita effettuale, the effectual truth, he explains why it is necessary to do evil. The world consists of the necessities of not coming to ruin in this world, as opposed to the demands or the attractions of salvation in the next world. There is such a thing as the whole world, but it is composed of worldly things that have a limit to their life and are variable. Deceit is an aspect of the world. In the actions of the world, men ordinarily understand little, especially not what is extraordinary. Yet in Machiavelli's effectual truth, the truth is not forever hidden, but is shown in its effects. Effectual truth means not only that the truth will have an effect, a consequence, but also that its effect will show. Princes must act so as to appear in certain ways, particularly in regard to religion. The deceit of the princes is expressed in what Machiavelli, borrowing from the Averroists, these were Aristotelians who were not Christian, or dubiously Christian, like Marsilius of Padua, and Averroes himself. They were Muslims or Jewish. Borrowing from the Averroes the notion of sect, S-E-C-T, that is. All sects or religions obey the necessities of human nature that require the people to be reassured that they do not live under the necessity of being commanded, and that justice is possible. The world is not such, most people like to believe, that we can just be ordered around by bosses, but somehow justice will prevail. But justice is not possible, Machiavelli thinks. Thus, the necessity that to do evil are not necessarily recognized. In fact, they necessarily will not be recognized by peoples as opposed to princes. Peoples as such believe in justice, and this is their necessity because they need justice. They're afraid of being too weak without it. The knowledge of the world's necessities includes the necessary ignorance of most human beings regarding those necessities. The world is the world of sense, the visible or empirical world. Good effects are what they appear to be. They are deeds, accomplished facts, faits accomplis. The accomplished fact of Machiavelli is the origin of a modern notion of fact. A fact is what everyone sees, including the vulgar. Indeed, principally the vulgar, because the vulgar many reveal the effectual truth of the few wise. Wisdom is in its effect on the unwise. It is not that the wise disappear or are no longer needed, but that their wisdom is effectual. And in that, it is as it appears to the many of their audience. A teacher, for example, the truth of a teacher, what a teacher teaches, is his effect on his students. That's the effect that wisdom has in the world. For example, the truth of Aristotle is in Alexander, his student. The truth of Plato is in the Platonists, or maybe the Neoplatonists, or maybe in the Christians who interpreted Plato. Nietzsche said that Christianity is Platonism for the masses. Machiavelli would agree. Fact is what can gain common assent, typically by being opposed to our intent or wish. Facts are stubborn or brute, standing in one's way and demanding acceptance. Sensational fact, such as the fact of Ramiro de Orco's death, that's a special sensational execution which occurs in chapter 7 of The Prince. Sensational facts like that are especially impressive. Beyond the prosaic matter of fact of Locke and Hume lies Machiavelli's sudden and fearful fact. Machiavelli's appeal to the worldly prudence of the prince amounts to an appeal to the peoples whom the prince must impress. Quote, "In the world there is nothing but the vulgar," that's what he said. They set the standard of success. In this sense, Machiavelli is fundamentally democratic. The people believe in morality, or in justice, as I said. And in order to believe that morality is possible, they believe that some person will make it possible. They personify the abstract notion of good in order to believe in God. Thus, Machiavelli shows that Christianity is the effectual truth of Platonism. His own personifications, such as Italy or the French, are spread all over his text and must be examined for what they personify to be understood. Opposed to the effectual or factual truth of a thing is the, quote, profession of good in all regards. You remember from the passage I read. The profession of good in all regards that is fed by our imagination. For Machiavelli, the foundation for morality, what makes it reliable, what justifies taking the risk of coming to ruin by doing something by doing a moral deed, is a profession that is a pretense of philosophy or religion. A profession of good in all regards would have to be the good society as a whole, not merely isolated good actions taken by themselves. So Machiavelli says that many rely on, quote, imagined republics and principalities that have never been known to exist in truth. He does not give examples, but it is easy to supply them. An imagined republic might be Plato's Republic of philosopher kings, based on the idea of the good. And an imagined principality might be St. Augustine's City of God, promising salvation in the next world. These imagined professions question the authority of fact in the name of reason or revelation on the basis of what is invisible, as if truth were to be found either in an intelligible or a mysterious world that makes sense of and is superior to the visible world. We don't see justice in the visible world, so we see it in an invisible world of our imagination. For Machiavelli, the world has its necessities in polemical contrast to those alternatives. He knows he has to defend the world, truly his world, against them. The world he defends is grounded in the earth, terra, so as to give it resistance to or leverage against the attractions of heaven, as set forth diversely by Socrates and his successors and by Christianity. To preserve either a republic or a principality, one must take it back to or toward its beginning. And this means that an appeal to patriotism will not suffice. One must revive the original fear that precedes and is the basis for any later patriotism. Machiavelli was a patriot, to be sure, though for Florence or Italy. And of course he says in a letter that he loves his patria, his fatherland, more than his own soul. As a philosopher, he might have said that his enterprise is grander than the defense of his patria, unless his patria is something even grander than Florence and Italy. It is. His patria is the world, of which he is a knower, sometimes presented as the earth, sometimes as Italy. The universal beginning is a first principle, but with a home. And the home is defined against what is foreign to earth and above it. Machiavelli's effectual truth is an attack by fact on imagination. The classical philosophers knew very well that all actual cities, all actual societies, are full of discord and injustice. And there is no disagreement with Machiavelli on this point. But they went on to imagine a society, a city, of harmonious justice, without dissension, in order to see what justice fully required. For them, imagination is an aid to reason. With imagination, one could rise above justice as observed to justice as it might be at its best and most complete, from fact to definition or form. Facts come and go. Facts are not, therefore, as intelligible as permanent or even eternal forms that don't change. This dog, as opposed to that dog, they come and go. But what is it that makes you call this dog or that dog dog? That's something which doesn't change. Imagination, I'm talking about now, but Plato and Aristotle, the classical philosophers, imagination fixes on the visible shape or form of things in order to make an image from which one can make an invisible form or definition. Looking at a dog, you can make an image of it and think what is essential to it and what isn't, and come up with a definition of the dog. This is how these classical thinkers could think, contrary to Machiavelli and his modern successors, that the invisible is more real than the visible. Realism, in other words, for them, is with the ought rather than the is, with the value more than with the fact. Now, imagination does not disappear from Machiavelli, far from it, but it is demoted from its status as an aid to reason toward knowledge to a deviation of reason away from, quote, what is done. Clearly, Machiavelli, like Plato, has a perfect republic in his imagination, one that may even last forever. It is not the one imagined to be what perfect justice would require, as in Plato's republic, but one imagined from reasoning with the necessities that face actual republics, in finding remedies for their imperfect prudence. This perpetual republic, as he calls it, if it could exist, would also be like Plato's under a philosopher king or a prince. The difference is that Plato has in mind not Socrates personally, but someone like him, a philosopher, whereas Machiavelli thinks of himself, basing his republic on the facts of actual republics. He introduces the modern notion that practice follows directly from theory, so that knowledge, or firm science, as he calls it, is perfected with practice. Knowledge is power. What Machiavelli knows is effectual. It makes him the prince, not just in principle, but in fact. Now, the whole world, for Machiavelli, can be characterized, that is the world which exists today, in his day, can be characterized by weakness because of the influence of Christianity, by corruption, because of French or Spanish or Italian customs. Yet it can also be, quote, full of peace and justice under the good Roman emperors between Nerva and Marcus, when one saw, quote, the world in triumph, golden times, quote, when each can hold and defend the opinion he wishes. Here would seem to be a John Stuart Mill paradise, or paradise of the First Amendment of the American Constitution, free speech, freedom of religion, with glory and security for princes and peoples, and freedom for philosophers. These emperors include, quote, the philosopher Marcus, as he is called in The Prince, in the one instance of that word there. But the philosopher emperor, that's Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic philosopher, who was emperor of Rome. The philosopher emperor is not presented as presiding over Mill's paradise. He is plucked out of the triumph of the world and paired with the emperor Severus, who was called a criminal in Machiavelli's other book, The Discourses on Liberty, to provide a model for the prince. Severus for founding it, and Marcus for maintaining it. All right to have a philosopher to maintain, but for a founder to begin things, you need a criminal. So, quote, the world seems not to be bereft of morality, as one might suppose from the adjective Machiavellian, as if Machiavelli were totally opposed to morality and thought it could be done away with. But it maintains a certain worldly morality of a new kind, in which the philosopher, namely Machiavelli, has a new role. Instead of soothing moral anger and opposing moral contradiction in the tradition of Socrates, the philosopher Marcus allies with criminality, Severus, rather than morality. Or better to say, he allies both with criminality and with moral indignation against criminality. Both are allowed to be expressed or purged because both are natural, not in the sense of intelligible in the light of higher principles, as with the Socratic philosophers, but as spontaneous eruptions that can be managed but not suppressed. If the world is not intelligible in the way of classical philosophy, according to Machiavelli, then how rational is it? Certainly it can be known, but how? The world is not chaotic, but it is tumultuous, open to change and discord as to its meaning, as for example in the diverse humors of princes and peoples. The world has its necessities, not in intelligible definitions or essences, but in patterns of behavior. In this example, princes and peoples are in a rather strange relationship. Those few who desire to command, that's how he describes the princes, few who desire to command. In relation to those many, the peoples, who desire not to be commanded. Here's the classical political division between the few and the many, to be found in Plato and Aristotle. But Machiavelli sees it differently. The few and the many are not presented in a manner to bring them together in a whole of quality, the few, and quantity, the many. Instead, princes and peoples are at odds. The former, the princes, insisting on what the latter, the peoples, insist must not be. The princes insist on commanding, and the peoples insist on not being commanded. These are the opposite or contradictory necessities that I spoke of. So the result is that each temper each temper has its necessity, but the two necessities are contrary to each other. And the result is not a harmonious whole, but a whole in which the necessary humor of the princes can be accomplished only by deceiving or manipulating the necessary humor of peoples. The princes must somehow fool the people into thinking that they are not being ruled or commanded. The The one necessity desiring to command includes the denial of that necessity by the other necessity, desiring not to be commanded. And princes, if they are to know the world, must understand that peoples as such do not understand the world. They are too moral to understand the world. Princes must see the necessity of deceit. Here we have in sharp focus the kind of analysis of necessities that are social science, unconsciously imitating Machiavelli, but very far from matching his acuity, retails with jargon and false precision. So these are the necessities that Machiavelli has in mind when he says, to return to the crucial paragraph that I read to you, that it is necessary to a prince to learn to be able not to be good, and to use it and not use it according to necessity. One might think that it is unnecessary to give advice to act according to necessity, as if necessity were a choice one could make or not make. But Machiavelli expands the instinctual necessities that dictate the action of subhuman animals. When he says that a prince must of necessity use a fox and a lion, remember the fox and the lion from chapter 17 of the Prince. He'll use the fox and the lion to defeat the wolf. The fox stands for fraud and the lion for force. You must use both for fraud and force. When he advises you to do that, he implies that a human can choose his nature rather than be enslaved by it. The human doesn't have to be a fox or a lion or a wolf. He has a choice. He can do all three, in fact. But that his choice, if he wants to be intelligent and successful, must still follow what he knows to be his necessity. We cannot help noting that human necessity is put to us by Machiavelli in terms of animal necessities, though with their different ways, which is after all a kind of enslavement. Our unique human faculty of choice is set to the task of calculating not the transcendence, but the greater efficiency through human versatility of subhuman instincts. Does this not describe the general method of social science today in its various findings of the determination of our lives? Machiavelli, however, has a deeper understanding of necessity because he is much more aware of the alternatives to it in classical philosophy and Christianity. For him, the world has its necessities in polemical contrast to these alternatives. He knows he has to defend the world, truly his world, against them. The world he defends is grounded in the earth, so as I said, so as to give resistance to the attractions of heaven. For him, republics and sects are preserved not by aiming at an end, still less by gaining it. Human institutions become corrupt if they do not return to their beginnings, rather than pursue the satisfaction of gaining their ends. At the beginning of human institutions, there is fear. So returning to the beginning requires reproducing original fears. Worldly philosophy abandons ends for beginnings. Now, to defend this world, Machiavelli decided that he would have to go beyond the equivocal compromises with Christianity made by the humanists and attack it directly and openly, rather than combine it and thus compare it with with classical rationalism as they did. He would have to, quote, depart from the orders of others and leave the ancients behind, much as he loved them. He would have to forsake the Renaissance. Renaissance means rebirth. rebirth of the ancients. And though Machiavelli very often refers to the ancients and wrote a whole book, Discourses on Livy, which is a commentary on an ancient historian, he loved the ancients, as I said. He departs from them. He creates something new. For the sake of philosophy and of humanity, he would alter the character of philosophy, uniting it with practice, with the result that it recommended a very different sort of humanity. No longer are we to imitate Socrates and Jesus. Our models now are Severus and Cesare Borgia, installing the new primacy of evil. Evil is somehow good, of course, but good folk, if they want to be reasonable, have to admit this. One other phrase from our single paragraph in The Prince Needs to be Examined. Machiavelli says that it appears to him more fitting to go directly andare diretto, to the effectual truth, go directly to that, bypassing the profession of good. To look at the effect or the outcome of an event means to consider it in the light of the necessity, that is, the various necessities of its participants, and thereby to ignore their opposing intentions regarding its goodness. Goodness is complicated, which is why it requires a profession of good in all regards. Necessity simplifies by going directly to the effect without regard to opposing claims and doubtful or contradictory reasonings. Machiavelli recommends acting first and reasoning, rationalizing afterwards. If there is a dirty deed which you are confronted with, and you think about whether to do it, Machiavelli says, do it. The reason for it will come to you afterwards. An example of what he wants to avoid can be seen in Siena, a city near Florence in Tuscany, the rival of Florence. And it has a Palazzo Pubblico, a public palace. And in that public palace is a Sala della Pace, the room of peace, the room of peace. And it has frescoes on those, in that room, on two sides. One representing good government and the other bad government. These were done in 1338 to 40 by the painter Ambrogio Lorenzetti. These frescoes show the effects, that's the word that's used, that's painted on the wall, effetti in Italian, of good and bad government on opposite walls. The virtues of the one and the vices of the other. The effects imply the possibility of a choice between virtue and vice. This is the choice we have in our lives. But these two walls opposite each other are connected by a wall that amounts to a depiction of the sort of profession of good to which Machiavelli refers. It displays both theological virtues and moral virtues. And justice, the word justice, appears twice. Once under the theological virtues, which feature capital punishment for disobedience, and once under wisdom, which leads to concord with a cord, actually painted, connecting all the citizens gathered together to a single man who represents the community of the city, Siena. Here is confusion, or let's say complication, arising from the typical problems of classical political philosophy mixed with Christianity. The relationships between intellectual and moral virtue, between theology and philosophy, between morality and political concord. In this painting, the political effects, good and bad, emerge from an articulation of the good. In Machiavelli, the effects result from an imputed necessity. it's he who says they're necessary, that deliberately ignores what people say and what thinkers think. Our social science today, for my third reference to it, believes in what it calls the fact-value distinction, meaning that fact is science and value is not. In so behaving, it ignores, as much as it can, the profession of good that accompanies every human action. Because every action that we make, we think is for some good. Or, if we're asked about it, we can come up with some notion of what is good. And social science follows Machiavelli's effectual truth unconsciously, and with brusque, unjustified confidence in its own independence. So to sum up, this compressed view of Machiavelli and his enterprise, which I've been giving to you, it is new, and it recommends what is new. It shows that the use of dirty tricks is for our good. It reveals the philosopher as a prince. It calls for the effectual versus the imagined truth. It finds that truth in the world, which is the world of necessity and the world of sense. It uncovers and explains what would later be called fact. It solves problems by simplifying them in the manner of modern natural and social science. A difficulty remains, however, in the notion of effectual truth. Is all truth effectual truth? Is philosophy now to have an agenda for changing the world, rendering it rational, and leaving behind the former philosophy that wished merely to understand, and not to understand for the sake of power to effect change? Machiavelli promises that the effectual truth will work. It will save us from ruin among so many who are not good. But is it true that it works? Have we not seen in the 20th century that atheist regimes can be as harmful to humanity, and indeed far more harmful than the religious ones that Machiavelli and Hobbes and all the other modern philosophers feared and despised and attempted to replace? The truth of effectual truth has to be judged by its promises, its professions of good. This truth would be plain truth, not effectual or tendentious truth. It is very difficult of access because the very success of Machiavelli's enterprise, which covers over its beginning. The modern philosophy Machiavelli founded, like the modern science founded by his successors, has the character of progress. Each stage going further than the preceding, and if not erasing it, rendering it obsolete. Machiavelli's ancient and biblical adversaries, and even Machiavelli himself, seem simplistic and irrelevant to us today. We are altogether too much impressed by effectual truth. Thanks.
Professor of Political Science and co-director of the Marshall Center. And if you'd like to ask a question, Mr. Professor Mansfield, we have the answer.
It can be a simple question, asking me to explain something. Those are the hardest.
Yes, sir.
So, Professor, do you feel that his enterprise was to speak truth to the prince, or did he dissemble to the prince for some larger purpose of enterprise?
Do I think that Machiavelli's enterprise is the truth for the prince or for some larger purpose? Yes, I think it's for some larger purpose, to improve the world.
What trick was he playing on the prince?
The trick that he was playing on them was that there was a greater prince that they weren't aware of, above them, who was directing them without their being aware of it. That's he himself. That's why I think Machiavelli is a kind of philosopher who is himself personally a prince. He's not just an advisor to princes. There's a chapter in The Prince, chapter 22, in which he discusses the relationship between the prince and an advisor. And it turns out that the examples that he gives in that chapter are of advisors who are smarter than the prince. That's always a difficult relationship. Machiavelli has to convince the prince. If you tell somebody that the way to get ahead is to play dirty tricks, the person who hears it might himself think that somebody's playing a dirty trick on him. Because that's what you teach, maybe that's what you practice. So that's a difficult relationship, and Machiavelli has to pull the wool over the eyes of the people that he advises in this way.
If I have my dates correct, in 1521, Luther was at the Diet of Worms, and after that, many of the principalities in Germany had the influence of Lutheranism to be able to create the separation between church and state. To be that Machiavelli would believe in the use of religion that way, to be able to have the people more conducive towards the state and the government, or how he would have felt about that at the time.
Right. He doesn't have principles like that. I mean, he was, and therefore he would like the church divided from the state, and the church subordinate to the state, and perhaps even the state subordinate to the church. Those are all possibilities that he could work with, if you like. Let me think what I would say further. The Prince was written just about the same time as Luther's famous theses were nailed up on the door. And in a letter towards the end of his life, Machiavelli does refer matter-of-factly to Lutherans as a force or power that he knew about. He did think that Christianity as a sect was corrupt because it didn't believe in itself anymore. A little bit like the way you could say that the Soviet Union fell at the end of the Cold War. It stopped believing in communism, the possibility of communism. And a remark that Machiavelli makes about the priests, that they do not believe in the evil that they do not, in the punishment of the evil that they do not see. He's directly calling them non-believers or atheists. So they don't have the zeal that they had, either originally or when it was in later occasions of the history of Christianity, when it was re-inspired. He mentions this by St. Dominic, the Dominicans, and St. Francis. Christianity was ready to be overturned or reformed. What form that would take is unclear. Whether he thinks, say, that it's necessary for people to believe, so there will always be some kind of religion. There's evidence for that. Or maybe it isn't. Maybe straight fear is enough. Put a man in fear, and you don't have to worry about whether he's going to believe. Or it could be some reformation of Christianity, like Protestantism. Or it could be a revival of some other religion, or the triumph of Islam. He speaks admiringly of the Sultan, Suleiman, and his great deeds. The Grand Turk, he calls it. So all this is as I say, a certain flexibility of attitude towards the possibility. But he was impressed by one thing in the Christian religion and in the management of it by the church. And that was this, and he shows it in the play that he wrote called Dracula. That, how does a priest govern you? He tells you that God has told him to tell you certain things. So when he's telling you to do those certain things, it's not the priest as a person who's ruling you. He's not ruling you directly, but indirectly, through God. So that's a very important way to use, to manipulate people or to make them think that they are ruling themselves. So God tells you to do it, and since it's God who tells you to do it, of course, then you will to do it, because you want to will the same thing that God wills. So you can, the church shows you how you can make people obey through a system of indirect government. And that, I think, was a kind of general prescription that he used for princes. And you can see that today in the modern notion of representative government. Government is always odious in some way or another. Yes, it gives you benefits, but it takes from you too. It takes from you death and taxes, military service. You don't think of that often enough today, but there it is. And of course, taxes. It takes from you your life or your money. And it tells you things, even if you favor the party of big government today, it orders you around in ways that cannot fail to annoy you or irritate you. So how does the government treat this? Is it by getting you to think that it comes from you? Why do we think it comes from us? Because we elect it. So if you don't like it, you don't get to vote to have no government, but only to replace the existing rascals with a new Senate. So, and this was also the way in which the Catholic Church renewed itself through a system of election. Yes.
Many leaders have been described as being Machiavellian. That's not always a compliment. But I'd like to ask your opinion of which non-American leader during the last 100 years best portrayed, or most portrayed, the Machiavellian principles.
Yes. So the question is, which leader in the last century or so?
Non-American.
Not American. So that takes the pressure off. It best be understood as Machiavelli. No, it's hard to answer because it's hard to say what approves of Machiavellianism as a whole or not. So somebody might use Machiavellian principles for a good end. Or somebody used Machiavellian principles for bad ends. So for bad, the latter one thinks of Stalin, say. Stalin or Hitler or Mao, one of the grand murderers. But then that's a little unfair to Machiavelli. He, you could say, helped to create the moral climate that they took advantage of. According to the communists and the Nazis, any necessary deed is good if it furthers the cause. That would be Machiavellianism made into a principle. But on the other hand, they weren't successful Machiavellians because they've all been either killed, like Hitler, or execrated after they died, like Stalin, or repudiated, like Mao. The present leaders of Mao, of China, you can say, in effect, repudiated his leadership. So they all admit that not only was their rule limited in duration, but their reputation. But in other words, they were unable to live after they died or left office. So in a republic, you could have, so let me now, against your instructions, refer to America. You can have a great president, or great presidents that we Americans like to admire and to argue about, who have an enduring reputation for good. So you could say that Machiavelli's main reason that he shows and gives for the virtue of a republic over a principality or dictatorship is that, and this is the advantage of the prince, that you're not, if you found a republic or contribute greatly to a republic, you'll be remembered and admired after you die. That has to be, of course, a satisfaction that you have while you're still alive. There's this strange kind of desire for a reputation after you're dead, when you no longer appreciate it, as if something's going to come along that makes you turn in your grave, causing you discomfort. So, my great American presidents are Washington and Lincoln. The first one founded our republic, and the second one saved it. And they both have a bipartisan reputation. So, of good. Most everyone, a few scholars, maybe not. Pinchy scholars. Then I put then there's the next lower stage is the great presidents who are only remembered with admiration only by one of the parties. Like Jefferson, Roosevelt, Reagan. So their accomplishment is a little bit at a lower level, because their partisanship somehow survives them, not forgotten. You hardly remember which party Lincoln was, even though he founded one of them, or Washington. Every American reveres them. So now I'm talking in my anti-Machiavellian reign.
Do you think there's anything to the old idea that the prince was a satire meant to expose the way of princes to the rest of the world?
Was the prince a satire to expose the dirty tricks of princes and therefore ruin their reputation? As this was argued by Spinoza and Rousseau, which were two highly respectable authors, not really common, ordinary, everyday, stupid scholars. But it's that really doesn't seem at all satisfactory. Because he said, Machiavelli also says many things against republics, and how a republic survives well by hating. But the most uncorrupt spirit of a republic is hatred. Hatred of its enemies and of its princes. And a republic has princes. He uses the phrase in the discourses, the princes of a republic. So the distinction between principality and republic is not perfect. But in fact, there are people with the nasty habits of princes who inhabit republics, and their nasty habits may be necessary for the success of those republics. So it's I make these anti-scholar remarks because the scholars like to whitewash Machiavelli and make him a good guy underneath. And they do that with, you could say, with the authority of Spinoza and Rousseau. But I don't think it works. They never consider the possibility that a person who seems evil might be more evil even than he seems.
Okay, well, why don't you share applause for Dr. Two quick notes. First, on your way out, there's a book by Professor Mansfield called Manliness. If you'd like a copy, you can purchase one on your way out. We'd be happy to sign it for you. And we have another event upcoming on March 27th. Catherine Zucker, professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame, will talk about Machiavelli's Man Dragula. So it's a nice connection. Thank you all for coming.